Radio 4 presents the Marx Steele Lectures, a series of lectures on people with a passion. Tonight, Karl Marx.
Few things can be more obvious than the fact that Marx was wrong. Because if communism really was better than capitalism, it wouldn't have needed a 50-foot high wall to keep people in, would it? If you had a party and discovered some of the guests secretly building a hot air balloon in an effort to escape, you wouldn't say, well, that was a successful evening. If you ever visited a communist country, it was even more obvious this was no ideal society. Like, I went to Czechoslovakia once, and the first thing I realised was that the currency was useless. I asked for a beer, and the barman said, ein krona. Ein krona, what's that, one? It can't be one, surely. 200 billion to a pound, it can't be one. Well, I went somewhere, a bread roll. Bread roll, ein krona. A one again? Everything can't be 1 krona. You don't do anything smaller than a 20. And of course you start thinking, well, how am I going to get rid of all this useless money? It's no good back in England. I thought I'm going to have to buy expensive things like maybe a helicopter. Maybe that's 6 kronas. But it doesn't work like that, because anything that isn't bread roll or beer, you have to buy with foreign currency. So there's people up and down the street going, psh, hey, Mr. Tourist, you come here, I sell you money, cheap money, I give you what you got, good rate, 4 times for you, special as you, all this. And you go in a shop, bread roll. Ein krona. I change money for you. I give you 4 times, 5 times special rate I give for you. And I thought, blimey, this would just be like going into your local greengrocers and the woman saying, there you are, darling, there's your mushrooms, there's your tomatoes. Do you fancy a bit of crack? What would you like, dear? 3 grams, that's a little bit over there, darling, all right. And yet the people who write off Marx equally don't seem to make a great deal of sense. New Labour argues that he's out of date because it was written 150 years ago, but why should that matter? When the Blairs are having a dinner party, do they throw their empty wine glasses in the air going, oh, don't worry, you don't still believe that old gravity nonsense, do you? Isaac Newton, that's 300 years ago. The glasses won't fall, they won't float, they'll find a third way into the dishwasher. So opponents of Marx can be just as crazy as any mad Stalinist. Now, when Francis Wheen was researching his biography of Marx, he found a book called Was Marx a Satanist? And the evidence is that
men usually wore beards in that time, but not beards like this.
So you could tell he was evil from his beard. Which, funnily enough, is what I've always thought about Noel Edmonds. Now, in this programme, I'm going to suggest that far from being out of date, there's little in the modern world that would surprise Marx, except for his own reputation, because he lived most of his life in poverty, unknown, and writing for just a handful of followers. And if Marx had seen the statues and the buildings and the towns named after him, he would probably have repeated what he said in an interview towards the end of his life.
All I know is that I am no Marxist.
Marx was born in 1818 in the west of what is now Germany, in the small town of Trier, and the area had been invaded by Napoleon, who began to modernise the region. So throughout his youth, Marx was surrounded by an environment of debate. His maths teacher was accused of atheism, his Hebrew teacher was warned for singing revolutionary songs, and his headmaster was threatened with the sack for taking part in a demonstration against censorship. What a fantastic school! Every lesson must have started with his teacher shouting,
Will you stop doing as you're told and start mucking about?
Marx then went to Bonn to study law, and from there to Berlin, but he'd already fallen in love with Jenny von Westphalen, a childhood friend whose father was the councillor for Trier, and from Bonn he sent her poems. For example,
I could 1,000 volumes fill, writing only Jenny in each line. Still they would a world of thought conceal, verses sweet that yearning gently still.
Now, you might not think much of that, but it hardly fits the image of the soulless economist presented by his enemies or by his communist supporters. They'd have you believe that the only love poem Marx would be capable of writing would be something like, when I look at your hair and see raindrops drip off it, I'm reminded that X over V equals profit. Marx asked Jenny to marry him, but she was uncertain. Her half-brother Ferdinand, however, was even more uncertain and asked the Berlin police to follow Marx and keep him in touch with Marx's activities. The police told Ferdinand that Marx wasn't attending his lectures and was drinking wine by the litre. Isn't that typical of the police? They're asked to spy on a student, and the best they can do is he doesn't go to his lectures and he drinks. If Ferdinand had paid him for another week, they'd have said Andy wears baggy jumpers and says things like, I'm so going to fail my exams. Marx then became a follower of the philosopher Hegel. Any idea, said Hegel, is in constant conflict with other ideas, and the result of this conflict is new ideas that leads to a new set of conflicts and new ideas and so on. And Hegel called this process dialectics. Now, that might not seem very controversial until you realise that if every idea is constantly changing, no idea in human society is natural. So take the idea of patriotism. Now, many people would argue the most important thing about us is our country, as if our nation has existed forever. Which isn't surprising, as everything leads us to think like that. Even at the Olympic Games, you get the commentary that goes, and they're away first time, and Davidson's looking strong out of the block for Great Britain, and Davidson's into his stride and extremely comfortable, and he's picking up the pace, and as they come up to the finishing line, it's Davidson in 7th place, and the winner's some American, then a Swede, a frog, a couple of Krauts, and what a run from Davidson! But looked at dialectically, for most of human history, there's been no such thing as nations. The idea of England or Britain is a very recent concept. When pagan travellers delivered the rocks to Stonehenge, the chief of the village didn't say,
Thank you very much. Here's a pound. Not a franc or a mark or a euro, but a pound, because Stonehenge is British, in Europe, but not run by Europe.
Take another example, language. You get people who write letters to newspapers.
Dear sir, I was on a bus and all these schoolboys kept saying, in it. My father was one of the many who rode to Dunkirk. If he'd known it would end up like this, he wouldn't have bothered.
Looked at dialectically, there's no proper language as it's constantly changing. It's like saying, why do we never hear the word forsooth anymore? That's the trouble with people born after 1604, no respect. So you can see how Hegel could lead to radical conclusions. And Marx agreed with all this, but he discovered what he saw as a flaw in Hegel, which was that, according to Hegel, the change was always driven by ideas. In this sense, Marx said, Hegel was upside down. Because it's not the ideas in our head that determine what lives we lead, it's the lives we lead that determine our ideas. For example, if someone's brought up on a rough estate in Birmingham and they end up with no work and no money, they may resort to stealing things. If you took the same people away from their environment at birth and brought them up to be 9th in line to the throne, at the age of 20, when they were presented to the King of Norway, they wouldn't go, here, mate, do you want to buy a set of knocked-off saucepans? Or another example is religion. It's often assumed that Marx hated religion, as illustrated by his line about the opium of the people, but his starting point was that, like all other ideas, it was a product of the environment. So Marx was sympathetic to religion. The whole quote was,
Religion is the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people.
He's like Cliff Richard. The problem with Cliff Richard is not that his music is religious, so's Bob Marley and Aretha Franklin. But Cliff is sanctimonious stars on Sunday, vicar of Dibley, tea cake, parish council, bring an unwanted tin of apricots to the harvest festival religion. For Marx, the first thing to look at in working out why it was that a society behaved in a certain way was how human beings in that society produced things, because from the earliest men we've survived by our ability to labour. Every extra person, he said, produces wealth as well as consumes it. Now this might seem obvious, but the dominant idea in Britain at the moment is we can't take any more people, we're full up as it is. But if it's true that more people makes us worse off, the most densely populated part of the world is Manhattan. So they should all be famished. But anyone who's ever been there knows it's a constant battle not to stuff your face 24 hours a day. Ask for a cheese sandwich and they go,
one cheese sandwich coming up. Oh, that comes with a buffalo on the side.
everything comes with pancakes. You have a huge fry-up piled up with chips and they whack pancakes on the top. Anything, you go for petrol. What do you want? 5 gallons of gas? Here's your pancakes to go. And Marx's theories guaranteed that he burnt all his bridges with his middle-class background. He hardly ever saw his father again, especially after his dad wrote him a letter suggesting he boosted his reputation by writing a poem.
To the honour of Prussia and allotting a role to the genius of the monarchy, executed in a patriotic and German spirit.
I don't think he quite got it, Mr. Marx, did he? If Karl Marx had written a poem to the King of Prussia,